This episode is brought to you by the V1 Project. Before we dive into today's episode of the LiftAffect podcast, I want to tell you about something that's really quite special to me. It's called the V1 Project, and it's all about bringing professional pilots together to create a supportive community. You know, being a pilot is more than just a job. It's a way of life. The V1 Project is here to help you cultivate a core set of values and virtues that will help you enhance not just your career, but all aspects of your life. Many of you have reached out and asked about the LiftAffect Mental Skills course for value-based living. While we're not offering that course right now as a standalone course, we have included it as the first 4 months of the V1 Project. So if you want to take that course, you got to go into the V1 Project to get it. But here's the thing. The V1 Project is not just about what you learn, it's about who you meet. It's all about building a strong sense of community. Picture yourself surrounded by like-minded individuals, all on a journey to better themselves and to support each other. Our motto says it all. V1 is a place for professional pilots to build community, cultivate and develop and express a core set of values and virtues for optimal living in a supportive community with encouragement and professional guidance. So if you're a professional pilot looking for something more, something that'll take your career and your life to the next level, head on over to thev1project.com. That's www.thev1, as in the number 1, not O-N-E, but 1, project.com. Join the V1 Project today, and let's go. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the LiftAffect podcast. I am your host, Matt McNeil, founder, clinical director, and director of human performance at LiftAffect, where we assist professional pilots with maintaining better mental health and optimizing their mental skills. The goal of this podcast is simple: to help pilots and other high liability professionals and disciplines come out of the shadows to discover how we can live better lives personally and professionally. Join us each episode as we discuss various topics ranging from mental health, mental skills and performance, to business, entrepreneurship, and a few other surprises along the way.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest episode of the LiftAffect podcast. I'm Karl Keller, your host, along with Matt McNeil, the engineering scientific guru of the day. And you'll understand that in a second. How the heck are you, buddy?
I'm awesome, man. I'm good. We're finally have summer here. So, because, we wouldn't be a podcast if you and I didn't talk about the weather a little bit.
Yeah.
It's become our thing. It's our jam.
Well, I had some rain, and that means that my grass will stay semi-green a little bit longer before it turns brown.
Yes.
And goes dormant.
Well, hopefully that rain isn't stranding pilots.
I hope not either. Okay. Inside joke, guys. Yeah. Hey, I got to tell you, our last podcast, boy, did it definitely generated a response.
Pretty funny.
And I'm going to be the first to say, I love what we talk about, and I love the fact that sometimes we really don't even know where it's going to take us. Mm-hmm. I wasn't sure if we had gone a little bit deeper than our audience would be interested in. Even though it's very interesting, it's something that is that something where we want to go? Well, I will tell you, holy geez. Let me see here. Some of the things. Your podcast, boy, this episode really scared me. Now, I'm not sure what that meant, but somebody got scared. Another was a very insightful comment, and I figure you can elaborate on it, where it was talking about engineering versus scientific, and how an awful lot of pilots have an engineering background or a strong foundation in that, and how that could create a sense of inflexibility.
Yeah.
And then we also, people were talking about bias and how the misinterpretation. So we weren't planning on having this as a episodic topic, but it definitely really, the audience was interested. So hopefully you're going to enjoy us continuing to delve this subject because it definitely seems to have caught the attention of a lot of our viewers and listeners. So I'm going to throw that at you. I really liked the comment about the engineering versus scientific and how it causes inflexibility. That was a kind of an insightful comment. I want to kind of lob that one at you first and see where you want to take with that, because that's pretty interesting observation.
So I agree. I thought that was really good. There was good feedback. Let me just touch on the fear piece. Somebody said this, your podcast listening to this made me anxious and fearful. I thought they didn't elaborate though what that means. Yeah. But I think science can feel scary, and I think studies can feel scary. And the whole goal of us talking about this is that I think it's easy to, read the USA Today or the New York Times or whatever paper you read, and they go, here's a study that shows that drinking coffee is going to kill you, or whatever it is. And then it creates this hysteria. And what most people don't do is they don't then click on the actual study and read through and go, well, is that actually what the study said? Or is that journalist just grabbing a headline out of it or a little chunk of it and saying, oh, it says this. And it's like, there's no context involved. So, or the study says, yes, drinking coffee leads to early death. And then you look at the design of the study and you realize, well, this is junk. There was no rigor at all to this thing. So the goal of this is just what I was telling Karl in the little pre-show here was, it would be great if we could give you all just enough of a couple of quick gouges on how to look at a study and be able to make a couple of key determinants of whether this was good science or maybe not so good science, or what level of rigor it actually was and what you can then infer from it. That's the goal of this. Mm-hmm. So I think the fear thing is real. I think science can be really scary in how things are presented and saying, here's a study that shows this. And then it creates, everybody's, oh my God, this is, it's the end of the world. And it's like, well, hold on though. Maybe that's not exactly true.
Well, look at all the different studies that come out. Oh, too much coffee will kill you or cause cancer. Oh, right. No, coffee's good for you. Eggs are bad. Eggs are good. And it's like, holy geez, how can all these studies be wrong and right at the same time?
Right.
And like you say, it's going to that next level and looking at it.
Yeah.
Because figures lie and liars figure.
That's right.
So to speak.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think it can show, some studies or science can show multiple factors, of whether. So that was the point. So, but yes, the one comment that really I thought was very astute in terms of high safety, high reliability environments, for, which is what this podcast is really for. It's for people that work in those environments, mostly pilots, because Karl and I are a couple of pilots, but there's also physicians and there's first responders. There's a couple of cops that have reached out that have found, that listen to the podcast, that like it, that think it's really speaks to them, which is cool. Even attorneys, so that's awesome.
We've had quite a few entrepreneurs.
Yeah, right. Yeah, people that got to wear multiple hats and are risking a lot. One of the comments that somebody had said was it was a pilot that has a background in aerospace engineering, is a commercial airline pilot, and he had said basically I'll just sort of summarize. This is not verbatim for quote because I don't have his email in front of me, but it was, hey, very very interesting, comment you made about. That engineering is much more concrete where science is not. And engineering in some respects is much more tangible because there's just factors that are kind of known, whereas science is looking at factors that are not known and trying to understand those things. And that as pilots, we sometimes can become rigid. And part of it is just because we have SOP and we have regulations that it's, you can't even do a checklist out of sequence, and there's a reason for that. There's a good reason why we do it that way, but it can lead to rigidity and in some respects, and that kind of mindset of the pilot sometimes becomes not helpful is this, it's black, it's white, it's got to be this way, where some things aren't black and white, they're gray, there's various shades. And I thought that was just a really astute comment, and I would want to follow up with this listener, and I'll follow up with all of you, is, well, how do you think this negatively impacts our job? That would be a good follow-up question. So if anybody's got any comments, or just please email them in. How do you think rigidity rigidity is good in terms of getting checklists, following procedures, having memory items, knowing what to do and when and in what order. I think we could make a good argument that that's a good thing, because the history shows when that's not there, it's actually quite a bad thing. But how do you think that rigidity negatively impacts our operating environment, and even just in terms of our psychology? Rigidity is the kiss of death. Rigidity is what leads to almost at some level, is a huge factor in what leads to mental health problems, whether it's depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive, or, all of the different spectrum of anxiety and mood disorders. Psychological rigidity is a huge factor in that. And one of the types of psychological interventions that I heavily use is something called ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. I love it because it's flexible. It can be used in a clinical setting. It can be used in a coaching setting. It can be used in an executive coaching setting, in a life coaching setting, in athletics. It's this really flexible model. But one of the things that it gets at is the foundation of ACT is psychological flexibility. How do we build more psychological flexibility so that we can navigate the complications of being alive? I think that was a really great comment, and I'm posing a question to our audience. Well, what are your thoughts on that? How do you think that this leads to problems as for pilots? I can tell you in our personal life how it leads to problems, but I'm even more interested in our operating environment. How does rigidity become problematic? So that's, without getting into that, because I want to see what comes back. I want to get the feedback on that so we can answer the right questions around that, or at least attempt to. But if we can, let's go back into studies for a moment. And I think one thing had come up, I had even mentioned it, I think, before, but maybe we could delve into bias. Can we do that? Is that a good place to start? Should we do bias? Yeah. So the way I think of bias is there's two kinds of, there's multiple types of bias, but there's two categories. What is some scientific bias? And especially in terms of scientific studies, what are the biases? When you're looking at a study, is it biased or not? And secondly is, what are just our personal biases? So before we get into science, let's just get into personal biases just for a second. We'll touch on that. So let's define what bias is. But bias is, I think the simplest way to define bias would be an error. A bias is an error, or a veering off from truth. And that can occur at any point and at any process. It can occur in a research process. It can occur in our thinking. It can occur in how we're interpreting our perception of things. And so from a personal point of view, there's some main biases. I'm going to cover 7, I think. I think there's 7 biases that I just can remember off the top of my head. And we can look these up. If we want to get deep into it, Karl, just say, let's go deeper, and then I'll pull up some stuff on this. But the first one is, I think of confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out, to interpret, to try to remember information in a way that just confirms our beliefs, which we all do all the time, right? I know I'm right. So I'm going to look for evidence to support my position, or my let's go a little scientific, my hypotheses, and disregard, or I'm going to downplay any sort of contradictory evidence that does not support my position.
I need to be validated.
Got to be validated. Yep. I know I'm right. I'm going to look for anything that supports my position.
And I refute anything that doesn't. I ignore it out of hand.
Yes. So an example would be, I remember, and I'll skip this, not to get political, but big thing I saw at LiftAffect with pilots during COVID was masks are stupid, masks are great. Vaccines are bad, vaccines are great. And then what everybody would do is they would, and I was just like, look, I'm not here to, I can just tell you the science that I know, but you've all got to make your decisions how you want to, whatever. You got to do what you got to do. But what they would do is they would send me, pilots would be like, they would send me all these clippings that supports their position. And it was like, okay, well, this is what this paper said, and this paper said, and this paper said, and this paper said. None of it was scientific, right? On both sides that they would send me. But it would only support their position. It was only looking at people that supported their position. They would never send me a contradictory clipping, right? So that is an example of confirmation bias. So we tend to ignore information that challenges us. Second kind of bias is availability bias. This bias happens when people are relying heavily on information that's just readily available to them, or that comes easily to mind when you're making judgments or decisions on something. And it can lead people to overestimate the importance or likelihood of events or situations or whatever it is that they're delving into that are just more memorable or more salient, even if they don't represent any sort of significance, statistical significance. So that's availability bias.
Would you put experiences in that category where that's all I know? I know that and it works. So that must be that's a way to do it.
Yep. That certainly can lead into availability bias, or what is just most, and then you get into like readiness, exercise effect, primacy, intensity, recency, like how we learn stuff. So availability bias is absolutely part of that. Then you have anchoring bias. Anchoring is this tendency to like rely on the first piece of information that's encountered. It's like, think about like you're dropping the anchor. And this initial anchor, again, back to the laws of learning, how we learn, this initial piece of information can then just influence all your subsequent assessments, even if it's arbitrary or if it's totally irrelevant to the decision that's at hand. People might insufficiently just like adjust away from the initial anchor, which then leads to biased judgment. So that's anchoring bias. Overconfidence bias, so I think that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Overconfidence bias is this tendency to overestimate our own abilities, our own knowledge, our own judgments. Could this be a problem with pilots?
Never.
I'm a pilot.
Never.
So, so people have excessive confidence in their own beliefs or predictions, and then that leads to errors in decision making, or just maybe a reluctance or an outright refusal to consider alternative viewpoints or information. So that's overconfidence. Then you have confirmation bias. It's this: we just seek out or interpret information in a way that confirms one's, their pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses.
Got that one.
Yep. Then you have hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is we perceive past events as more predictable or obvious than they were at the time. And so after you learn about some kind of outcome, people might like exaggerate their ability to have predicted accurately. And then there's one more. Oh, what is the last one? Stereotyping. Stereotyping.
We've hit 5 because you did confirmation twice.
No, I did confirmation. You're right. I did. I'm sorry. So 5. So then stereotyping is the last kind of, I'm thinking interpersonal bias. Actually, there's one more I just thought of. Yeah. So stereotyping is when people rely on preconceived stereotypes or generalizations. We could talk about what stereotypes are, but it's usually about a particular group or category of people when making judgments or assumptions about people within that group. And the problem with stereotypes is they lead to unfair judgments. They can lead to prejudices, and outright they can lead to discrimination. And so that's, and then the last one is the halo effect, which is the tendency to generalize a I guess, favorable or unfavorable impression of a person or group based on one positive or one negative trait or characteristic. So you have a bad interaction with a flight attendant. Oh, all flight attendants are bad. Or a bad interaction with a pilot. And all pilots are bad. Or so on and so forth. So that's the halo effect.
The one, how I would equate that is that often it's not that the message is bad. It's just that you shoot the message because of the messenger.
Right.
So somebody or something may be very valid, but because of a bad experience or an excessively good one, you're now giving more credence or no credence to something that should have been more so because of that.
I mean, and here's another way to think about it too, is that like if people are physically attractive, then a lot of people, there's a halo effect. So you assume that they're intelligent, or that they're kind, or that they're giving, or,
because you want them to be.
Right. So my ex brother-in-law, he's black. He's got dreads, he's a big guy, tattoos, ripped, but he's from England, and so he'd get pulled over by the cops, which look, he'd come out and visit, he'd always get pulled over. So I don't care whether you say it's biased or not, but he'd get pulled over and he looks like, he's kind of scary dude. But then he would open his mouth and this very proper British would come out, and you would see like the level of tension would just drop. Oh, he sounds really smart. It's just
educated.
It's educated, which,
articulate
because he's got a British accent, right? So, I mean, so that look, that's the reason why people on the news are typically very good looking, and they've got because it instills confidence and trust, and it's trustworthy, right? I mean, but that's a halo effect. So here's what I want you to do. This is for those of you that waste your time on Facebook. Go watch an argument where people get into this tit for tat nonsense. Everybody's got an opinion. And it's so funny because every single comment, nearly every single comment that somebody puts on there is confirmation bias, is anchoring bias, is availability bias, is stereotyping, is hindsight, it has a halo effect. And you could just sit there and be like, okay, so that statement that you said, that's biased with this. Okay, and that actually is biased with it. I mean, it's just like, it just shows the absurdity of these like banters back and forth where everybody's an expert. Okay, so that is the types of personal, and I'll say this, we all have some of this at times. We do. And when you become really mindful, so I'm thinking like, let's think about science now. We're trying to kind of veer into, what does this have to do with science? Science is about the exploration and openness of being wrong. That's what science is. Science is not about being right. Science is about being wrong. And if you're not willing to look at biases, you're not going to get very far in terms of experimentation. You're not going to be open. If you're not allowing yourself to be wrong and monitoring where you're being wrong, where your bias is coming in, you're not going to, there's very little evolution that's going to come out of that. And so I think it's okay to have your biases and be aware of them. And it doesn't, nobody's perfect. These things are here because this is human behavior, and there's all sorts of influences that happen and reasons why we become biased. And it's not about saying I'm never biased, just being aware of when you are. You're like, you know what? I think I'm getting into a bit of hindsight here, or I think I've got a halo effect here on this, or I'm stereotyping a little bit. And when you become aware of that, it allows you to sort of like let that go and discover maybe something new.
I agree. I mean, too often it skews your perspective and your expectations, and can lead you down a very bad path because of either your prior experiences and saying, well, that's the way it's always been, so that's the way it's going to be, and not looking at the fact that things are very rarely exactly the same. There are changes, and to be aware of it, and things do evolve. And I agree with you that I think part of it is always to self-examine and go, am I looking at this through clear lenses, or if I got my rose-colored ones on and I'm seeing and doing or believing what I want to believe, not what is. And that's a very dangerous thing, is we often want to believe something so bad. It's kind of like on a date and they're attractive. You want to believe that that person is all these things, and you will intentionally overlook the red flags, things that are going, this is not the kind of person, not because they're bad. It's just, you're not going to connect with everybody, but because in this case, they're physically attractive, you're willing to overlook so many things. And then down the road you go, well, how come I never saw them? Or what happened? She used to be this, or he used to be that, when it was there all along. You just weren't willing to open your aperture and go, what am I really looking at? And you're right. It's very, we all are susceptible to that. And it never stops.
Yep.
It's a constant reevaluation.
And maybe a way to apply this for our community. I know there's a lot of people going through contract negotiations, and people are really upset, they're really stressed. Maybe try to approach some of the proposed changes from the lens of, okay, where are my biases coming in about whether this is good or whether this is bad? Are there some of my biases happening here? And it'll allow you to see things in a different lens. Maybe in terms of how your company's hiring or expanding or contracting, or how they're doing training, or how they're, changes to the FOM in some respects. It's like, it's very easy to get biased about whether you're deeming something as correct or incorrect. And becoming aware of your biases allows you to see with a more clear lens of whether a change is going to have the effect that it's intended to or not.
When you're talking about all these things, I think one of the most important things, and people have probably heard this so many times, but it's bears repeating, and that is, do your own due diligence. Mm-hmm. Don't accept things at a face value. The information is out there, and when somebody says something, don't just accept it as a fact. If do your own research, because just because somebody said it doesn't make it true. Like, just because it's on the internet or in Wikipedia doesn't make it true.
Right.
Do your own due diligence, so that the decisions and the beliefs you come with are yours, not someone else's that you've just inherit or accepted.
Yep. I totally agree. 100%. Okay. So let's get into science now. What are the biases when you're looking at a scientific study, or you're reading about something that was science? I'm using air quotes here. What are biases that can happen in there? And again, it's just a bias is an error that and it usually happens not only in our interpretation, but it can happen even in the research process, that can affect validity and reliability of a study's findings. And so maybe we should clarify validity and reliability. Should we do that?
Sure.
I think that's probably good. So they're different. So you hear people say, well, there's reliability, there's validity. Validity refers to the extent to which a study measures what it intends to measure, and that it captures what you're trying to measure in the investigating. So if you're measuring, if Matt drinks coffee, does it change his eye color? And what comes out is you're measuring that, well, it actually changes how long his fingernail grows. There's a problem with the validity. You're not capturing what you were trying to measure in the experiment, which is the eye color. And that happens all the time. And some of that is, there's good, like, oh, hey, that's a good new experiment like that's a happy accident. Let's maybe there's something interesting here. But that original hypothesis it's the null is supported. It did not capture what you were looking at. So that's what
sometimes unintended breakthroughs that you weren't expecting, but it wasn't like you said, the initial intent of that experiment or study.
That's right.
It's
so high validity means there's credible, you can trust the results, and that it accurately represents the intended research topic. And so there's types of validity. There's internal validity, which looks at the degree to which a study's findings can be attributed to the variables being studied, rather than like there's confounding factors. Sometimes we call those confounding variables, or alternative explanations. There's external validity, which refers to how can you generalize this to the general population or to other populations. So you could have a little study of like there's 5 people with they drink coffee and it does show that there's a change in eye color, but let's say all those people were Italian American. Well, does that apply to Irish Americans or to African Americans or to Hispanic populations? That's what external validity is. How much does it apply to other populations? There's construct validity, which examines whether the measurements or do they represent the theoretical constructs being investigated. So there's so much to go into there. And then there's content validity, yada yada yada. Okay, so that's validity. What's reliability? Reliability is the consistency, the stability, the repeatability of the research findings, which is why good studies you repeat them. And they're not one study could be like, okay, it showed this, there was, good alpha power, good statistical significance, but you want to be able to do the study again and again. And good research is, it's been shown to have scientific reliability. They did 100 studies where they repeated it and it came out with the same conclusions. If you do one study and then you do another one and it shows the total opposite, okay, well, you might have good validity, but the reliability is not as good. So it's got to be reliable. It's the credibility and trustworthiness. And then there's types of reliability. There's test, retest. There's inter-rater reliability. There's internal consistency reliability. There's a bunch more. We won't dark out about that. So, okay.
I do have one question, though. Would there be such a thing as peer reliability? You're doing all these different things. The ability for someone else to replicate it doing those same things, would that be also a kind of reliability and validity?
I think that there's, let's talk about, I think you're kind of getting at inter-rater reliability. Inter-rater
I'm not
reliability.
sure. That's why I'm just wondering if just because you do it, if no one else can replicate it, even if they're,
So yeah, that's actually a really good question. I like that question. I've never thought of it like that. So when you have a study, you have people that rate and or observe the study. Now, obviously, these have to be, you want people that are trained in how to rate, and how to observe. You don't just grab a guy off the street and be like, hey, come on in and observe, right? I mean, he may not know how to observe correctly while keeping his biases under control and understanding the scientific process. But it's that type of reliability measures whether there's consistency between raters, there's consistency between observers, and it's assessed. There's a technique called Cronbach's alpha, which measures the correlation between different items in a scale, which is very important, very, very important that you have this. And this gets into the types of instruments that we use to interpret the statistics or the study to create statistics. I think that would be the peer piece, and this is even why journals are peer. They're journals that are peer-reviewed journals, meaning you take the best scientists in a field, not just from one institution, but many institutions, and then you have all of them read through and analyze, okay, is there good validity? Is this reliability? Is there good reliability? What's the strengths? What's the weakness of this? And then they kind of opine their interpretations of this. That would be, I think, the peer piece that you're referring to, but I've never really thought of thinking it like that. But that is professional peers. So
right, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah. So there's the types of biases when you're looking at a scientific study. Selection bias, and this happens when a selection of study participants is not represented of the target population, or there could be factors that are related to the outcome that's being studied. So, for example, if you have, what would be a selection bias?
Well, to me, where you're kind of predetermined. To me, a predetermination would be, or where you're kind of setting yourself up as an example historically from the Nordic countries. You're going to have a higher preponderance of blue eyes and blonde hair, right. And if that's all you're selecting from, you're going to skew your results definitely compared if you grab them from another part of the world.
Right.
So you've kind of predetermined by narrowing your selection rather than doing a cross section. You're selecting a segment.
Yeah. So like,
to me, that's what I think of.
Yeah. Here's an example too. Like, let's say, and we're gonna have a guest that's coming. Our first podcast interview is coming up. I'm not gonna tell you who it is, but because you'll find out soon. Well, you know who it is, but he's a scientist, very well-known scientist in this area, and he's looking at pilots, pilots in healthcare and this and that. And like, if you take a group of pilots and you're like, okay, let's look at how often they go to the doctor or not. That doesn't apply to the general population because there's factors that influence that with that particular group. So that might show, there's validity and reliability within the pilot population, but you can't really assign it to the general population because there's all these other confounding variables. So you wouldn't say like, well, we took a group of pilots and so that's what the population is like. That's what the rest of the world is like. There is a selection bias if that's what you interpreted that as. So that's the first piece. Sampling bias, which is very much like selection bias, and that it happens when the sample used in a study is not representing the target population. And so this can happen because of non-random sampling or self-selection bias, where individuals choose to participate in a study. They differ systematically from those who don't. So sampling bias, you got to be very careful that when you're designing a study, that you're not... Look, you can have those biases, but you have to acknowledge them in terms of the results. So you got to be careful with that. Then there's measurement bias, which is like if the way that you're measuring something or the way that you're collecting data is flawed, that would then lead to inaccurate observations or incomplete observations. And this can happen because of observer bias. Maybe the observer's expectations influence their measurements. It can be social desirability bias, where participants respond in a way that they perceive as socially desirable. This is why when we talk about double blind, it means not only are the participants blind, so are the observers. They're blind. That's why you don't want to, all of this is to eliminate bias. That's the point. So that's measurement bias. And then there's reporting bias, which means that what you choose, it's cherry picking what you choose for. And I see, oh, you're nodding your head, right? Because we see this all the time. And this is what journalists do, is they cherry pick stuff out of studies and they go, see, coffee's bad for you. And it was like, well, that may be one data point within the study, but you're misrepresenting actually what that says. Talk to me.
Literally. Like you say, I said earlier, it's, figures lie and liars figure. Yeah. You are taking something out of context that says, see, that proves my point. Well, read the rest of the sentence, read the paragraph.
That's right.
And then you're going to realize in many cases, it says the exact opposite, when it puts all the context. So you're right. That is, to me, is one of the worst things, because people are selecting whatever it is that they feel like will prove their point, regardless of what the intent of the actual full wording in this case, or data, would lead you to believe.
That's right.
I'm just picking this one little piece to say, see, this causes cancer. Right. See, this is going to cause accidents.
Right.
And you can have a greater chance of having an airline accident, aircraft accident because of this. Well, look at the whole thing. Is that really what it's saying?
Right.
So yes.
And sometimes people will say to me, man, like, well, I read these journals are so stupid. Why do they publish studies that showed no significance? Well, because researchers, if researchers are only likely to publish studies with positive or significant results, while studies with negative or non-significant findings go unpublished, that's a problem, right? So you don't want researchers cherry picking like, well, I mean, and guess who does this? Who's the worst offenders of this? Pharmaceutical companies. They will only publish the studies that showed that where there was significance with the drug, but they didn't show you the 300 studies that showed that there was no significance or it was no better than placebo, which just drives me crazy. But that's, when the, who's funding the study, when the company that's doing the study is also funding the study, that's a big problem, which is why universities, you get NIH grants and you get grants from different places where it's not the institution that's funding the study, it's some other party. So there's not this conflict of interest. So that's reporting bias. And then when you think about when you publish, there's publication bias, which is just like reporting bias. Refers to journals and researchers might be more inclined to publish studies with statistically significant findings, while studies that support the null or that are negative results, they just go unpublished, right? So that you don't report it, you don't publish it. And then confirmation bias, researchers, they have these expectations about the outcome, and then which leads to more selective interpretation or attention or reporting of results that align with their expectations. Funding, believe it or not, there's funding bias. So financial interests, again, look at pharmaceuticals, they're the easy target to blame, but even think about an aviation research. I mean, do you want Boeing doing the study? An Airbus? There's a risk that it's going to influence design and how it's collected and how it's analyzed and how they report the results. We all know what we're talking about here. This becomes a problem. And then there's time or period bias. This is the last one I'll do. Time bias.
I have.
Go ahead.
No. Finish your.
So time bias is as things change, like societal norms, technology, maybe environmental conditions, over time, that might confound the relationship that's being investigated. And so that's what time bias is. And it's not one of the bigger ones you really need to be thinking about. But anyways, okay, I loaded you with a ton of stuff. If you're looking at studies, you want to look at time, you want to look at confirmation, funding bias, publication bias, selection bias, sampling bias, those kinds of things. You want to look out for those types of things.
I want to throw one at you that just while you were talking, it came to my mind, and it may be included somewhere else. But I've always thought of science in large part being the process of elimination. Like you say, all the things that don't work, ultimately, I've always said, once you've eliminated everything that doesn't work or isn't, right, what's left must be what is.
Right.
But one of the things that I would call is elimination bias. You remove something because, that won't work. So you've automatically removed without even testing to find out whether it could actually be validated. You've automatically assumed because they won't. It's not that. Boom. So I've always felt like to be careful what you eliminate and make sure. Big time. So that's why I say I don't know if elimination bias fits anywhere else, but I think that can be a very dangerous one, and it happens in real world with us every day with the best place, and that's relationships.
Yes.
Yes. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
You got to be careful, and that's a really good point. We can even, I want to do this like a 5-part series now. But there's errors. I mean, errors in science is really can be there are better errors to have than not good. I mean, what you don't want is an error that says, and this can think about it like if you're testing a drug, like a chemotherapy drug or a drug to save somebody's life, and you say, you know what? The drug has no effect when the drug actually does. That is a very dangerous type of error. And some people think it's more dangerous to say the drug works when it actually doesn't. I think in terms of what we're talking about, we could talk about aviation safety, but I think it's just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, to say there is no significance when there actually is. So these types of errors, and we could get into that at some point. So errors are dangerous. Now, look, the point of this is not for you to go, every science study is BS, because there's all of these types of issues that could happen. A good scientific experiment accounts for all of these types of biases, all of these types of errors, and designs it around, has a correct experimental design to eliminate those types of issues. So don't think, oh my God, everything is BS. No. Good science. So the topic was, what is good science? Good science knows this stuff, knows this and builds a design and selects and creates all of it, all of the metrics and factors around the study to eliminate these types of issues. So don't be paranoid.
even though they are out to get you.
They're going to get you.
Well, I think we've come to the end of this part of this definitely very in-depth question that we started with on our last podcast. Before I finish it up, what's the takeaway for today?
I think I just said it. Good science is going to allow you to feel that this has been accounted for and that they've looked at this. And that's why I think going with, where it's funded and who are the researchers and what is their level of training matter. This stuff really does matter in terms of knowing how to design a study. And you can see the complexities of it. So don't be paranoid. Just make sure it's reputable and that it's coming from a fairly neutral place. And you could say, oh, it's all fixed and it's all rigged, but then I can't help you with that. But I think that's the point is good science has this type of rigor built into it. That's it.
Well, we've come to that time of the episode on Everyone where we ask you to please let everybody know about us. There are so many other things that compete for people's time. And we appreciate the fact that you're willing to spend about 45 minutes of your time listening to us. Please leave reviews, send more comments. As you can see, we take the comments very seriously. We want to expand our audience. So thumbs up, review us, rate us, get the word out. We really appreciate it. All comments go to podcast@LiftAffect.com. We appreciate you. You're the reason we're here. Until next time, have a great day and a great rest of your week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the LiftAffect podcast. If you want to dive deeper into this episode and every episode, go to our website, LiftAffect.com/podcast. If you're enjoying the show, we would love it if you'd follow us on Spotify and rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. We really appreciate your support. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all with the ID Matthew McNeil. This show is brought to you by LiftAffect, a clinical mental health and consulting company that assists air carriers, corporate flight departments, pilot unions, and commercial pilots by providing comprehensive psychotherapy and mental skills coaching services to pilots with mental health and mental performance-related issues. Visit LiftAffect.com, that's LiftAffect.com, to book your free consultation. And finally, this podcast is for general informational purposes only. It does not constitute the practice of counseling, psychotherapy, medicine, or any other healthcare service, including the giving of medical advice. No therapeutic or provider-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and any materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining advice for any psychological or medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the LiftAffect podcast.